Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair and our independent bookstore partners across the US, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Mark Kurlansky to discuss the importance of not being earnest, My Life with the Uninvited Hemingway, published just today, happy book birthday, by our very own imprint, Books and Books Press, with Mango Publishing, recently named 2020's #1 fastest growing independent publisher by Publishers Weekly. Mark Kurlansky has worked in New York as a playwright and playwright in residence at Brooklyn College, as well as many other jobs, including commercial fisherman, dock worker, paralegal, cook, and pastry chef. In the mid-1970s, he turned to journalism, and from 1976 to 1991, he worked as a foreign correspondent for the International Herald Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, the Miami Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Based in Paris and then Mexico, he reported on Europe, West Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. His articles have appeared in a wide variety of newspapers and magazines. His books include Havana, Cod, Salt, Paper, The Basque History of the World, 1968, and The Big Oyster, among many other titles. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by the founder of Books and Books Bookstores and co-founder of Miami Book Fair, Mitchell Kaplan. We'd also like to shout out to our partner bookstores for tonight's event. Books and Books at the studios in Key West, Florida, Book Passage in San Francisco, California, Elliot Bay in Seattle, Washington, Gibson's in Concord, New Hampshire, Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass, the King's English Bookshop in Salt Lake City, Utah, Left Bank Books in St. Louis, and Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., and Village Books and Paper Dreams in Bellingham, Washington. Thank you for your partnership. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you should post questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And please order your copy of The Importance of Not Being Earnest from your favorite indie bookstore partner. I'll be sharing some links in the chat. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Thank you, Christina. And hello, Mark. How are you?
Oh, Mitchell.
Listen, I don't really often get a chance to thank Christina for all of the amazing work that she does on these virtual events. I know that many of you out there have been, for the last 3 years, taking advantage of these amazing author events that we've had virtually. And Christina and her team, I don't think we could do it without it. And then all of you who are our partner bookshops, I want to thank you as well for doing all the great work that you do in all of the cities that you do it in. You know, this, indie bookstores are alive and well, and it's because of all the great work that all of you are doing. And now I have to thank Mark for all of his incredible support that he's given all these years to independent bookstores and to us in particular, since I want to be extremely transparent and let people out there know that Mark and I have known each other for close to 40 years, if not over 40 years. This is our 40th anniversary of the bookstore. And I think Mark was the very first customer who ever walked in, right? And I can actually say that I knew Mark before he ever published a book. And with The Importance of Not Being Earnest, this is Mark Kurlansky's 35th book. And Mark, I can actually tell you, when I first met you, I never would have imagined that you'd be the author of 35 books. Welcome.
Welcome to you, Mitchell, and to all the independent bookstores who have always been my lifeblood. I'm just so appreciative of all of you. And, while I'm doing thank yous, I mean, Mitchell, I kicked around this book idea for years, and you were the one who, really pushed me to get it done. And also thanks to Mango, who did such a beautiful job with my watercolors and everything.
They really did. I'll show you, we'll be talking about this as we go further, but the cover of the book is one of Mark's watercolors, and peppered throughout the book are a series of watercolors. We'll talk about what that means to Mark and how in his travels, being a painter of watercolors is something that he pursues. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what you just said, which is you've been kicking this idea around for this book for a lot of years. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, you're in for a huge treat, because I don't think there's quite a book like it. So Mark, why don't you describe it a little bit and talk about how this idea came to be?
Yeah, well, it all came about while fly fishing, oddly enough. And, the thing about fly fishing is that probably the reason I'm a writer is that I just have a dialogue that's going on in my head all the time, and it never stops. And the great thing about fly fishing is when I'm fly fishing, it stops. I'm thinking about insect catches and pools and trying to think like a trout. And I fish for beautiful rainbow trout in a river called the Big Wood, tributary of the Columbia that runs through Ketchum, Idaho. And about 10 years ago, I was fishing in the Big Wood, and suddenly, one of those thoughts that's not supposed to come to you while you're fishing came to me, that I was approaching the bank where Hemingway stood and blew his head off. And the first thing I thought, which was extraordinary, is I realized that I was older than he ever lived to be. Now, this is a little disturbing because in the town of Ketchum, I mean, to not think about Hemingway in Ketchum would be like going to Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood never coming up, everywhere, these pictures of this old guy, sort of hunched over, and calls himself Papa, and he looks ancient. He was younger than me. So that was a little disturbing, but then there was something liberating about it. I thought, I'm on to new chapters in my life, because it just seems that, Hemingway is always there. I'll give you a recent example. I was walking down the street in my neighborhood in Manhattan last weekend. The doorman, apropos of nothing, shouted out, "Hey, you look like Hemingway." I mean, who asked him? But, Hemingway just has always been there for one reason or another. I was in Idaho the day that Hemingway killed himself. Got in an argument with my father because my father said it was suicide. The newspaper said it was an accident. I'd like the accident version.
Well, let's stop right there for one sec. So I want to go, because, anyone tuning in understands the resemblance, but beyond the physical resemblance, what you point out so clearly in the book, and what's so unusual, is that from a very, very young age, you always wanted to write. You knew that writing was something for you to be doing. In fact, you have this great line in the book, which has to do with a writer, but also that you're daydreaming. You say that, I used to daydream a lot. People used to always say, Mark is a daydreamer. And then you actually own up to it and say, I was in an alternate universe most of the time, right? So
still am, I think.
Exactly. So, but that alternate universe took you into the universe of books and writing from a really young age. I mean, you were not even 10 when you started thinking about writing, right?
All I wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer.
And so talk about, even as a 10-year-old or younger, what your relationship to Hemingway was then.
Well, Hemingway was the most famous writer. And, he was in Life magazine and everything. Hemingway was in Spain. Hemingway was bullfighting. Hemingway was killing animals. I don't know what he was doing, but you know, it, you always thought about Hemingway, and I thought that, you know, this was a writer's life, which is why I got upset when my father said he killed himself, because how could the man living the ideal writer's life want to end it? Well, we could get into that. But
So it wasn't as if you were fly fishing and then you thought back on your remembrance of Hemingway. Hemingway had always been a part of who you were as a writer, right?
and for a series of coincidences, I spent most of my life in Hemingway places. I mean, I lived in Paris for 10 years. I've been writing about bass for 50 years. I've been writing about Cuba for 40 years. You know, I've been going to Idaho for a long time fishing. Why do I go to Idaho? It has nothing to do with Hemingway. I started going to Idaho because Idaho has the largest, or one of the largest, bass communities in North America. And the Basques invited me to go there. Nothing to do with Hemingway. Most of the stuff had nothing to do with Hemingway. Hemingway was far from my thoughts when I first started going to Cuba, you know, revolutionary Cuba. And I wanted to write about the revolution. I wasn't going there to write about Hemingway. But when I went there, it seemed like people just wanted to talk about Hemingway a lot.
But what's cool, I think, is what you point out in the book, you know, even though you were young, just how central Hemingway was in the 50s, right? He was, if you were a writer, if, you know, you were, you know, Hemingway was, you know, basically someone you wanted to emulate, I imagine. At the same time, you read Hemingway. You have this great story about how when you went off to school for the first time, you picked out a Hemingway novel, and all you know, talk about that a little bit.
Farewell to Arms. I remember that Scribner's paperback edition that has the wood grain, the gray wood grain cover. And, you know, my parents, typical thing parents always say, you know, they say, because you had a free day before classes began. And, you know, and so I had my own room. I had a room to myself, which I had never in my life. I'm a twin. I've never in my life had a room to myself. So that was pretty exciting. And my parents said, go out and make friends. I said, yeah, okay, I'll go. They left. Bye, Mom. Bye, Dad. Oh, what's this Hemingway book here? I sat down. I spent the entire day reading A Farewell to Arms. I finished it by dinner time. And I don't know that I've ever been more moved by a book in my life.
Yeah, so basically, I just wanted to establish that this Hemingway, you know, you call him the uninvited Hemingway. And it's not something that you manufactured. It was kind of very natural in your life that Hemingway was a part of it from about as early as you could possibly imagine as a writer and a reader. And it's not as if you tried to emulate him at all. In fact, you say that maybe the only city that Hemingway was responsible for you going to was Paris, right?
Yeah, because, you know, after Hemingway died, during the 60s, it was like he got resurrected. The Carlos Baker book came out, A. Hotchner's book came out, and posthumously, Movable Feast came out.
Right.
Movable Feast was enormously popular, and everybody was talking about, you know, Hemingway in Paris, and Gertrude Stein, and Scott Fitzgerald, and all of this stuff, and so that there was this very popular notion that Paris was a place for writers to go. It really wasn't by the time I went there, but it was probably, you know, Hemingway was probably, or Movable Feast was probably in the back of my mind when I made a decision to go there. I mean, I had been there a couple of times, and it looked like a nice place to be, you know.
Well, what I think is really cool, what you've done so successfully here, is that you talk about these places. It's kind of a dual. It's an autobiography and a kind of very, you know, episodic and impressionistic biography of Hemingway as well. We all know there are millions and millions of books on Hemingway, but I think what you did here by juxtaposing your life in these places with what Hemingway's life was like, it
Yes,
gives you a kind of before and after sensibility as well.
right. I mean, when Hemingway went to Paris, and all these Americans went to Paris, because Paris was incredibly cheap. The dollar was very strong against the franc, and it cost almost nothing to live in Paris. When I went to Paris, it was the reverse. Paris was very expensive. The dollar was weak. The franc was very strong. And, you know, there were still a few little old fashioned, inexpensive places. There was this wonderful woman, Maria Cadena, who was from Barcelona. And she had a restaurant where she served paellas for 5 francs. And she was an old Republicano, a socialist, and this was her ideal. She said, "There's a lot of people who can't afford more than 5 francs," and so there were a few of those wonderful places left. Not many, none now, but it was such a different life, and there were all these people there. There were all these Americans who kind of wanted to be Hemingway. They wanted to be writers, and Hemingway was their image. And
now you were there in the late 60s, early 70s, right?
And they hung out in the bookstore and they talked about Hemingway. Everybody went to all of the Hemingway sites. Now in those days, Hemingway sites weren't marked. They didn't have plaques on them. So I and my wife settled into a room in an inexpensive hotel in the 5th arrondissement. Because when we had been there as tourists, we had spent a lot of time in the 5th. So it was a neighborhood that we knew. So we settled into this thing. And through the Carlos Baker book, I soon realized that Hemingway's first apartment was around the corner from where I was living. And I mean, this is sort of typical of my life, which meant that all of the neighborhood places I went to were places that Hemingway went to and wrote about it. And it seems like the whole time I lived in Paris, I could never discover anything that I couldn't have found by reading Hemingway.
Well, paint a little picture of what Hemingway's Paris was like. I mean, so many of us have read about it, but what are some of the more unusual things that you bring out in your book?
Well, Hemingway moved to Paris at a time where Paris, because it was so inexpensive, was becoming the center of an art movement, modernism in painting and music and writing. And there were Hemingway and Joyce and all of these writers who were in Paris were out to change writing, and they did. I write differently. We all write differently because of modernism. And Hemingway, although he was a commercially very successful writer, was an avant-garde experimental modernist and trying to do, as his friend Ezra Pound used to say, make it new. So artistically, it was a very exciting place.
Well, there was Joyce. Joyce was there, Pound, Elliot, all of these expats, post World War I came, and Gertrude Stein ran these salons.
Recreating literature and painting and music. And,
right.
There was nothing new being created when I was in Paris. These American writers who were there, rather than trying to make it new, were trying to make it old. That's when I first started to become very wary of the idea of being Hemingway, of wanting to be Hemingway, because I didn't want to be these people who, by and large, I didn't think were ever going to be published.
Well, isn't that the problem with nostalgia, right? I mean, it was basically a nostalgic looking back. I remember when I read A Movable Feast, mine was in the late 70s. And I decided to go to Paris. I used it as a travel guide, basically. Not being a writer, for me, it was trying to go to these places that he went to in order to try to capture some of that cafe life of the 20s that appealed to me so well.
Right, but you couldn't capture it because it wasn't, the movement wasn't there anymore. There was no. I mean, can you imagine, when James Joyce came out with Ulysses, which nobody wanted to publish because it used the F word and a few others. And so Sylvia Beach in the bookstore published it. And it's like you, you know? She published this small edition of this book that completely changed literature, that is so revolutionary that even when you read it today, it seems revolutionary.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a literary world that didn't exist when you or when I went as well. But I think, you know, what I got out of it was this kind of romantic view of what a cafe life was like, which was very different than what my growing up in Miami Beach was like. So for me, it was a kind of nostalgic, you know, thing, which actually influenced me only in the sense of the idea of having a literary community, even though it wasn't there when I was there, you know, of trying to create that same kind of thing.
Well, I have to say that it was different from Hartford, Connecticut, which is where I grew up. It was nothing, and that's a good thing.
But I think the difference too, and you know, being a writer, you were having constantly, because you were also, at the time you were in Paris, I believe, you were also writing fiction, right? You were trying to write fiction, and you made the choice to begin to be a journalist, right? You said, I'm going to be a journalist at that point.
And it was partly a commercial decision, you know, it was a way of earning money. But I also thought it'd be an interesting thing to do, not forever, but, you know, the wonderful thing about being a journalist is that you get to go to all sorts of places, meet all sorts of people that you would never meet, enter worlds that you would normally never be allowed into. So it was a great experience. Not
Well,
a good exercise in writing, however.
no, but that also, you create the link with Hemingway, who also wrote journalism, right, for the Toronto Star and other things.
Yeah, in fact, it's kind of funny that in one case we worked on the same story, except that his was the 1924 version.
Oh, tell that story. Which one was that?
73 version. It was an interview with the Royalist Party, with the Henri Comte de Paris, who was the pretender to the French throne. And Hemingway interviewed him and wrote about the Royalist Party from a 20s perspective. Then other things went on in France, you know, and the Royalist Party became totally Nazi. And Henri Comte de Paris was a Nazi collaborator. And I didn't do this story, by the way, because Hemingway had done it. I'd done this story because I was kind of curious about this guy. And this was the first interview I ever did in French. And when you're interviewing in another language that you haven't interviewed in before, and they're saying strange things, you always wonder, am I hearing this right? For example, the prince said to me that he had to side with the Nazis because the British had killed he said, the flower of French aristocracy in the Battle of Quimper in 16 something or other. And I'm writing this in my notebook. Am I hearing this right? Is this really what he's saying?
Well, you know, and what you discovered while you were in Paris too, which I found really interesting, was a direct line to what you then began to do as an author, right? So you discovered, I believe it was in Paris, right, where you discovered the writers who were writing about food. Was it in Paris?
Yes. Well, in Paris, but in Spain and in Italy, in Europe.
In Europe, you just, while you were there, you saw these people writing about how what food meant to the various cultures that they were writing about.
Historically, and Americans didn't do that. I also worked for the International Herald Tribune, and there was a guy writing for the Tribune named Waverly Root, who had a food column, who also, interestingly, just another curious coincidence, was a retired Chicago newspaper writer, which I later became. And So I started to get, Root wrote these wonderful articles with a great sense of humor, not always strictly correct, but great reads. And it was a great way to approach food. And I thought Americans should approach food this way. And I started writing about it. And
Did you write about it in the Herald Tribune? Is that where you first? But what's interesting too, and the draw to Hemingway and the parallel or the connection you make with Hemingway in the book is you point out that really the kind of journalism that Hemingway wrote was more in the vein of what we would call either new journalism or literary nonfiction, really. So he started literary nonfiction in a lot of ways. And you say so many great things about the leads that he would write. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's an interesting thing that the particular way that Hemingway wrote is often attributed to his newspaper experience. They call it cabalese, and you had to pay so much for each word. So you wrote very succinctly in few words. And all this stuff, I don't think is true at all. I think Hemingway wrote the way he wrote because it's the whole idea of modernism. Modernism, you strip things down. Ezra Pound used to go through his copies. Take this out, take this out, take this out. Don't use adjectives. Ezra Pound was totally against the use of adjectives. And so he developed this style of modernist writing. His short stories, which are my favorite Hemingway. I love his short stories. I love short stories in general. I love to read them and I love to write them. I've published 3 books of short stories, 3 collections of short stories. It's my favorite kind of writing because it's pure storytelling. And what you notice when you pick up a book, a collection of Hemingway short stories, you just read the first line of each story. They're all great. He always wrote a great opening line, which, is kind of a newspaper thing. Because, when you're reporting for a newspaper, the lead is everything. I always felt like, you had to get back to the hotel on time to file the story. And then driving back to the hotel, I'm going, what's the lead? What's the lead? Because if you had the lead, you had the whole story. Hemingway wrote great leads.
But you point out that if it wasn't Hemingway and if it was someone else writing some of the leads that he wrote, an editor might just spike that lead, right? Because he tended not to have that modernist tradition in some of the journalism that he wrote.
No, his journalism, I don't know. I can't imagine an editor. If I wrote Hemingway's newspaper copy, nobody would have published it. No editor I ever worked with. And, one of the curious things about Hemingway is that his fiction is more honest and more factual than his journalism. If you look at something like the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, just piles and piles of journalists, competing. And Hemingway had the best sources because he was a celebrity. And he had all of these great sources. Most of them were communists. And he didn't write anything that made them look bad, which made him some enemies in the press because they did some bad things. Hemingway didn't touch it because it would mess up his sources. But if you read For Whom the Bell Tolls, it's all in there. He talks about all of the atrocities of the Republic and as well as the fascists. It's very balanced. His fiction is good, balanced, fair-minded journalism, whereas his journalism is very prejudiced, narrow.
Yeah, but all right. So now we're in Spain, which is another one. The book has actually got these chapters of Paris, Spain, Cuba, and Ketchum, and New York as well. So now we go from Hemingway being in Paris, Hemingway being in Spain, and you being in Spain as well. So talk about both of those.
The curious thing about Spain is that of all these places, Spain was the only one where I went to the same place that Hemingway left. I mean, because we talked about how Paris was no longer the same. I went to revolutionary Cuba. Hemingway left at the time of the revolution. We knew completely different Cubas. But Spain was the Spain that Hemingway knew. It was a fascist country.
Yeah,
It-
Franco lived so long that he maintained his grip on the country.
Nazi salutes, and
Yeah.
it was people, you'd go to interview somebody in their office and they'd have an Iron Cross from Hitler proudly displayed. And it was, you felt like you stepped into a time warp, but it wasn't a time warp, it was just that Spain had not changed.
So what brought you to Spain? What brought you there?
Well, originally, I think what brought me there was what brought Hemingway there. That if you live in Paris, Spain is like a really cheap place to go. It doesn't cost much to get there, and it didn't, it was in Franco. Oh, we lived so well under fascism. For a few dollars, you could get this incredible meal. It was. I always used to say, I used to tell friends in Paris when they come back from trips to Spain, they say, how was it? I said, it was like being rich. It's like, you see what it's like to be a rich person. But it was also, strange and kind of horrifying. And
Well, you write about a very horrifying experience that happened to you and your wife.
yeah, Guardia Civil just dragged us into an alley, and you realized they could do whatever they wanted.
Well, and so that is another sort of parallel. But then you also, your experience there led to a deep fascination with Basque Country, right? I mean, we all know the books that you've written about that. And
this is what happened. I went back to the U.S. and I visited every major paper that didn't have a correspondent in Spain, which is most, including the Miami Herald. And I said, here it is, the last 1930s European fascist state, and waiting to be overthrown, and nobody's covering it. And at times I'm really a good salesman. Oversold this one. They all bought into it. I go to Spain and nothing's happening. Everyone's just waiting for him to die. But the Basques assassinated Admiral Carrera Blanca, Franco's chosen successor. And so because of the Basques, Franco had no successor. And I thought, oh, well, I guess maybe there's something going on in Basque Country. So I went up there, and there was little stuff going on, the defacing statues. I mean, you gotta understand, in Spain, nothing moved. People weren't protesting, they weren't defacing things, they weren't writing graffiti. You didn't speak the Basque language or you'd be arrested. It was a tight lid on everything. They were starting to deface statues, and little things were going on. Also, it struck me as one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen on earth. And this ancient culture that I really didn't get to know until after Franco, because it wasn't allowed. But the way the Basques have preserved, the reason the Basque language isn't like any other language, it's not that it was a totally original language, it's that none of the other cultures in that family of languages have survived. This is a language from before the Indo-European invasion of Europe. So yeah, I became fascinated with Basque, and I love Basque country.
And that was in the 70s, right? That was pretty much still in the 70s. But it did lead to another, you talk about Franco coming to power with Hemingway being in Spain, and it led to you being there when Franco gave what? His last speech, right?
Yeah. You want me to read that?
Go ahead. I'd love you to read that. That would be fantastic.
This is a strange thing that in 1975, I got to witness the final death knell of 1930s European fascism. On October 1st, 1975, I was told that Franco would appear in the Plaza de Oriente, an oval-shaped plaza with many small streets leading into it. The crowd gathered with a kind of energy that seemed to suck in everyone from surrounding streets, like water pulled into a drain. Overhead, a small plane was putt-putting, trailing a yellow and red banner that said Arriba España, which is the Flanders motto. And the crowd snapped their arms at 45-degree angles, repeatedly thrusting out the fascist salute while shouting, Franco, Franco, Franco. A weazened, shaky little figure, balding to almost hairlessness, gingerly stepped out on the balcony. Hitler would have looked like this too had he lived this long. It was the portrait of Dorian Gray, at last revealing all the sins, all the evil, all this decrepit face. His voice was so weak that I could not hear what he said above the shouting. He acknowledged the crowd, and I'm not sure if he said anything. I wanted to ask someone, but everyone around me was so consumed with the straight-arm Sieg Heil-like ecstasy, shouting Franco, 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 that I couldn't talk to anyone. With an aide's help, he staggered back behind a curtain and was never seen again. At last, Spain had ended its 1930s. 1975.
It's really, it was chilling when I read that, knowing that you were there and all of the aftermath. So from Spain, you then decided that you were going to cover another part of the world, and you began to cover the Caribbean, right?
Yes. Well, actually, first Mexico. I moved to Mexico. I did that for a couple of years, and then the Chicago Tribune had an opening for somebody to cover the Caribbean. And that's when I moved to Miami and found this little bookstore.
So talk about that period and the period that brought you to Cuba and what you found there and the fascination with Hemingway in Cuba, obviously.
Yeah, well, I went to Cuba. Originally, I went to Cuba from Mexico. The Cuban ambassador invited the foreign press in Mexico to come to Cuba. And some CIA guy at the American embassy said we weren't allowed to go, which of course wasn't true because journalists could go. But it made the trip so much better just knowing that the CIA was trying to stop us. They didn't really do anything to stop us. It just felt good. And of course, I wanted to write about what Cuba was like now in the revolution. And it was a fascinating time. The Soviet Union was bankrolling the socialist experiment, and they were doing everything differently. Weddings were different, marriage vows were different. The whole way medicine and education was pursued, and just trying to create a completely new society, which they could do because although it was not economically successful, the Soviets just kept putting money into it. So that's basically what I was writing about in Cuba, but I was not there very long before somebody said, want to see Hemingway's house?
So how did Hemingway find his way to Cuba? We know that he also found his way to Key West as well. How did that nexus get created for Hemingway?
Well, he was in Key West fishing the Gulf Stream, the Florida Straits. And one end of it was Key West, and then there was Bimini in the Bahamas. At the other end was Havana. The Gulf Stream goes right by Havana. And he basically moved there for fishing. He wanted to leave Key West because his home, as it is today, was on the tourist map. It was when he lived there. Everybody who visited Key West went to go look at Hemingway's home, and oh look, there he is. He couldn't stand it, so he left, and he went to Cuba. And he lived in Cuba longer than he lived anywhere else in his life. But when I went to his house, and eventually because you can't go in, but eventually through connections I was able to go in. And you look around his house, and there's almost nothing Cuban in it. It looks like there also isn't a lot that's Basque. I found this one leather case with the seals of the 7 Basque provinces. It's the only Basque thing I found in the house, and nobody could tell me how it got there. But the house looked like the house of an American living in Spain, and with a little bit of the Fish and Game Office in Boise, Idaho thrown in. Because, all these kills were on the walls and on the floor. It really didn't have much to do with Cuba at all.
And he had a very fertile writing period there as well, right?
Oh, well, as I say, it was the longest period in his life. He had fertile periods and infertile periods. Wrote some of his important books there. There's all these posthumous books which Scribner's leaks out a little at a time. And, you read these books, people read these books and say, oh, well, Hem really lost it. These aren't very good. But, he didn't finish them. They were unfinished works, and they were interesting. And you could see that he was trying. He wasn't he wasn't doing a copy of himself. He wasn't trying to do Hemingway books. He was trying to do new things. He was still trying to do new and innovative things.
And while he was in Cuba, you point out that, like in Key West, but differently, he became something of an idol to so many Cubans, right? Who were there, whether it's the bar that he hung out in, or when he would walk down the street, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, the Floridita, the bar, there was a certain spot where he always stood, and there's now a life-size bronze statue of him in this spot. And it's almost like they won't let him die. He's still there in the bar.
Well, you told the story about when you walk down the street.
Yes.
People are constantly going, there's an American writer, so you must, it's a shout out for Hemingway, right?
Right. I just remember one day, it was Father's Day, and one of the things about how Cuba has a lot of American things, adopted a lot of American things, and one is that they celebrate Father's Day on the same day that we do. So it's Father's Day, and I'm walking down the street, and I'm sort of missing my daughter, and all these people are shouting out, "Hola, Papa!" And I'm thinking, oh, that's nice. They figured out that I'm a father, and then I gradually realized that wasn't what was going on at all. They were pretending I was Hemingway. When Hemingway walked down the street, they'd go, "Hola, Papa," and he'd wave at them, and having no idea who they were because he had terrible eyesight. And I somehow was cast into this role of Hemingway walking down the street.
You say something really interesting. I mean, the mythology around Hemingway everywhere in the world. You have a quote by Julian Barnes where he's talking about how there are all these like Hemingway lookalike contests, but he says other countries don't. Well, I forget the exact quote, but
they don't have a Dickens lookalike or Hugo lookalike
or a Camus lookalike or any of that sort of stuff. No, it's true. The mythology of Hemingway is larger than life. But speaking of life, I mean, we now get to a point where you kind of diverge from Hemingway pretty significantly. I mean, Hemingway, was, when you look back, I mean, he had a really rough inner life, right? He was not the happiest guy in the world. And you actually have a line that I love in your book, because I know it's true about you, where you say, I was not unhappy about not being unhappy, right? And so there's where you diverge from Hemingway. You didn't need to lead that part of Hemingway's life.
Yeah, by the time I got to Idaho, I mean, he was so, I mean, you just look at the pictures, he was miserable. He was in Idaho.
And a lot of it had to do, we underestimate, or maybe we don't, but people write about, the effect of war on Hemingway. Hemingway, from one war to the next, from one altercation to the next. You have another great quote where you say, Hemingway went to war instead of college. I went to college instead of war,
Yeah.
right? And that has to do with the fact that you could have ended up at war, but you needed that student deferment, right?
Right, right. And I hated the war in Vietnam, and I was absolutely against it. And there was a moment that the Hemingway influence again, where I thought, gee, as a writer, I would get great material if I went to Vietnam. And then I thought, wait, I'm going to go somewhere and kill a bunch of poor villagers because it'll get me good material. that didn't.
Right. But it's also very interesting because Hemingway, particularly in the First World War, I mean, he was an ambulance driver, right? And a lot of the ambulance, but he never was, right? That's what you point out.
I mean, he in World War I, he went to the front on a bicycle distributing chocolate bars.
Right, and that's where he got blown up, in fact.
And he was hit with a trench mortar. In the Spanish Civil War and World War II, he was supposed to be a journalist. He wasn't supposed to be in combat at all. He kind of played around with it. It's not clear, probably not as much as he claimed he did. At one point during World War II, the other journalists had him called in because when you're a correspondent, you don't want a correspondent who's going around with a gun participating in the war, because you're going around saying, "Don't shoot me, I'm not a combatant."
Right.
So they got pretty upset with Hemingway, and he was called in to explain himself, and he denied using weapons, and he denied all the stories that he had told. And we don't know what was true and what wasn't. His role in the liberation of Paris is probably a complete lie. I am absolutely certain that he did not liberate the Hotel Ritz. I mean, it's a known fact there were no Germans at the Hotel Ritz when he got there. I mean, you think about it. The Germans are losing the war. They're on the run. The Allies have just taken over Paris, and the Germans are sitting around in the Hotel Ritz. What is that?
Right. Exactly. So point out to me, or paint the picture if you can, of what drew him to Ketchum, what his life was like in Ketchum, and then it's a very devastating portrait of what happened to him at the end as well.
Yeah, he was invited to Ketchum. You've been to the Sun Valley Inn, that they have all these pictures of celebrities on the wall, and what these pictures are paying their dues. They invited all these movie stars and celebrities to come to Sun Valley, and they fix them up with whatever they want. Oh, you want to go hunting, whatever. And all they had to do in exchange was pose for pictures. And that's how Hemingway first got to Ketchum. Later on, he stopped living in Sun Valley and rented places, and eventually bought a house. To my way of thinking, the least attractive of the Hemingway houses, and a kind of a sad place. He went hunting. I used to know the guy who used to take him hunting. Very nice guy named Bob Purdy. He died a couple of years ago. And
very touching scenes you have, about Hemingway living there with. You have one scene in which you point out that Hemingway didn't really speak that much in public, right? He didn't give a lot of talks, and he gave the eulogy at somebody's funeral, and he seemed to have fit into that life really well. But at the same time, he was undergoing shock therapy, right?
Towards the end, he was getting shock therapy. And the thing about shock therapy is that you start to lose your memory. Well, for a writer, any writer, to lose your memory, that's it. You can't write. You're finished. And for Hemingway in particular, because Hemingway had a spectacular memory and he lived off it. He never took notes, which means he probably got some things wrong. But he just had this great memory, and that's what he wrote from.
So now, how did it's a stretch, but talk about your connection to Ketchum, which was distinct from Hemingway's, right?
Really distinct. I mean, as I said, there's a huge Basque community in Idaho, and every fall, the sheep. There's a lot of sheep raising there, and a lot of the sheep raisers are Basque. And every fall, they move the sheep from the high pastures down to the lower pastures for winter. And they have a celebration. They drive the sheep through the main street of Ketchum, which kind of takes a toll on the main street. But it's a tradition. And in Idaho, they brought in Scots to herd the sheep, and then when Scots didn't want to do it anymore, they brought in Basques, and now they have Peruvians do it. So they have this festival that one year celebrates Scots, one year Basques, and one year Peruvians. So on the Basque year, they invited me to come and give a speech and talk about Basques. And I really liked the place, and we really liked the place.
How did you end up there, though, on the day that Hemingway died? How did that happen?
Oh, because when I was a kid, every summer, my father was a dentist. I know that's a little sensitive for you today. So he could take off time when he wanted to. And every summer he took off about 6 weeks. And we packed in this huge Buick. Remember, in those days, cars had sat 3 in the front and 3 in the back. We were a family of 6. And we just spend the summer traveling out west. And we just happened to be in Idaho when he shot himself.
Wow. Wow. Well, all of these threads led to this spectacular book, The Important Ernest, My Life with the Uninvited Hemingway. And we do have some questions from the audience, but I also, before we get there, want to make sure that I point out to people who have not gotten the book yet, that among the millions of different things that Mark does, includes these incredible paintings. And Mark, you can talk a little bit about, watercolor and, your travels. Mark Mark, talk about what a flaneur is and how that could describe you to some extent as well.
Wanders around, takes everything in. I started a long time ago, many years ago. In my notebooks, I would start sketching things, people or things, because I found that I never forgot anything once I drew it. There's Idaho, Castle Rock, and I do sketches to remember things, and then after a while, forget about the words. I did the word somewhere else. Yeah, there's a lunar eclipse over Pigalle in Paris. So whenever I traveled, I did watercolors wherever I went, and I now have, I think, 29 books of watercolors. So I think there's 10 of them in here.
Yeah, and there are 10 of them in the book, and the cover itself is one of Mark's watercolors as well, which is really beautiful. So let's take a couple of these questions that we do have. I just have to say that it's very cool. There's somebody who's tuning in from London, where it's 1:52 in the morning. And their question is, will this end up on YouTube? And it will indeed. So it'll also be at, it'll be on YouTube, and you can find it there. So this is from one member of the audience. Given my age, I'll never be able to read all the books in the world. So would you recommend 3, Mark, that ought to be read? And maybe we should recommend 3 of the Hemingways that people should not miss.
3 Hemingways that people should not miss. Farewell to Arms. I would just say a Farewell to Arms and all of the short stories. The short stories are Hemingway's best writing.
And which of the biographies would you recommend of all the ones that have been written?
You know, it depends what you're looking for. You know, Carlos Baker was the standard biography. Hemingway's family felt that he didn't really capture the man well. Reynolds' biography maybe does a little better on that score. But there's just so many from so many points of view.
And Mark, the person who asked about the 3 books, they really want to know about your 3 books, which I alluded to a little bit before, and that is that you came to Miami, and I credit the fact that you came to Miami, which started this 35-book trek, this very fertile period in your life that started in Miami with Continent of Islands, which was about the Caribbean, and then you started writing this incredible, this sort of, narrative nonfiction. And so which 3 are your favorites of the ones that you've done?
Of the nonfiction?
Yeah.
I don't know. Definitely The Basque History of the World is one of my favorites. The Big Oyster, which is about oysters in New York City, but it's really a cautionary tale about taking care of urban environments. I don't know. This is very hard to do.
Well, I'll tell you, I particularly love Cod. I thought that was really kind of a remarkable book. And I also loved The History of the Basques. I thought that was, for me, it opened up a whole new world that I knew nothing about. Those would be, and your oyster book as well. Those 3 would be the ones that I would recommend to somebody who's listening in. We have somebody who has a really great question. We don't have a lot of time, Mark, but I think it's a terrific question. And that is, given if Hemingway were alive today, what do you think he would be like as both a person and a writer?
Very old.
Yes. He'd be 123 years old, but
right. I think that he, assuming a big hypothetical, but if he had stayed healthy and working, I think that he would have gone on to new genres and created new things in literature. When you look at the books he left behind, the unfinished books he left behind, you can see that he was trying to do that.
you say something that's really interesting, and this brings up a little bit about this right now. I mean, it's about who Hemingway speaks to, and who he speaks to as the image and the mythology of Hemingway. You actually say in the book, you were talking about Hemingway and the mythology and the image, and you said, I suppose women writers were not interested in being Hemingway.
When I was in Paris and there were all those writers trying to be Hemingway, they were all men.
Right. So the question, I think, and this is something I don't know that we can go into right now, but it's certainly something to ponder. And that is, how Hemingway, would he be able to adjust terribly well to this, the multicultural universe that we all exist in right now? That would be a very, very interesting question that I don't think we can handle in 1 minute.
But I just say that he was very diverse. He wrote about all kinds of people. He wrote about all kinds of women. People try to, say he was a misogynist or this and that, but it's hard to nail down because he wrote about lots of different kinds of women.
Interesting. And you'd think also with the desire that he had to be inquisitive, that it could take him down a million different roads as well.
Yeah, and he all kinds of people.
And I think, a good way to end this would be a little comment that somebody has, which I think speaks to the fact that how lovely and how wonderful it'll be when you guys who are out there decide to grab this book. There's somebody in the audience who goes, you know, I just finished the book today and thoroughly enjoyed it. A unique approach to Hemingway. I love the watercolors. And in fact, I can't write in my own journals without including one every now and then. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you. So nice to hear.
Mark, you know, it's always great to see you. This has been, you know, just so wonderful to spend this time on Zoom. Next time it'll be in person. I hope that we'll get you down for the Miami Book Fair, and that we can all meet and raise a glass of wine or something. And I look forward to giving you a big bear hug when I see you next. Thank you, my friend. And thank you for all those 35 books that you've written.
Thank you for selling them.
And I thank all of our partners out there for making this as successful as it is. Thank you to all those bookstores. And all of you out there, go to your favorite bookstore and make sure you pick up a copy of The Importance of Not Being Earnest by Mark Kurlansky. Mark, thank you, my friend. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
As always, great talking to you.